Chapter 13. The big day arrives. The sun was shining brightly on the morning of the big day, but the ground was still white with snow and the air was very cold. Outside the gates of Wonka's factory, big crowds of people had gathered to watch the 5 lucky ticket holders going in. The excitement was tremendous. It was just before 10 o'clock. The crowds were pushing and shouting, and policemen were trying to hold them back from the gates. Right beside the gates, in a small group that was carefully shielded from the crowds by the police, stood the 5 famous children, together with the grown-ups who had come with them. The tall bony figure of Grandpa Joe could be seen standing quietly among them, and beside him, holding tightly onto his hand, was little Charlie Bucket himself. All the children, except Charlie, had both their mothers and fathers with them, and it was a good thing that they had, otherwise the whole party might have got out of hand. They were so eager to get going that their parents were having to hold them back by force to prevent them from climbing over the gates. "Be patient," cried the fathers. "Be still. It's not time yet. It's not 10 o'clock. Behind him, Charlie Bucket could hear the shouts of the people in the crowd as they pushed and fought to see the famous children. "There's Violet Beauregard," he heard someone shouting. "That's her all right. I can remember her face from the newspapers." "And you know what?" somebody else shouted back. "She's still chewing that dreadful old piece of gum she's had for 3 months. You look at her jaws. They're still working on it." "Who's the big fat boy?" "That's Augustus Gloop." "So it is. Enormous, isn't he?" "Fantastic." "Who's the kid with a picture of the Lone Ranger on his wind cheater?" "That's Mike TV. He's the television fan. He must be crazy. Look at all those toy pistols he's got hanging all over him." "The one I want to see is Veruca Salt," shouted another voice in the crowd. "She's the girl whose father bought up 500,000 chocolate bars and then made the workers in his peanut factory unwrap every one of them until they found a golden ticket. He gives her anything she wants. Absolutely anything. She only has to start screaming for it and she gets it. Dreadful, isn't it? Shocking, I call it. Which do you think is her?" "That one. Over there on the left. The little girl in the silver mink coat." "Which one is Charlie Bucket?" "Charlie Bucket? He must be that skinny little shrimp standing beside the old fellow who looks like a skeleton. Very close to us. Just there. See him? Why hasn't he got a coat on in this cold weather? Don't ask me. Maybe he can't afford to buy one. Goodness me. He must be freezing." Charlie, standing only a few paces away from the speaker, squeezed Grandpa Joe's hand and the old man looked down at Charlie and smiled. Somewhere in the distance, a church clock began striking 10. Very slowly, the great iron gates of the factory began to swing open. The crowd became suddenly silent. The children stopped jumping about. All eyes were fixed upon the gates. "There he is," somebody shouted. "That's him." And so it was. Chapter 14. Mr. Willy Wonka. Mr. Wonka was standing all alone just inside the open gates of the factory. And what an extraordinary little man he was. He had a black top hat on his head. He wore a tailcoat made of a beautiful plum-colored velvet. His trousers were bottle green. His gloves were gray. And in one hand he carried a fine gold-topped walking cane. Covering his chin, there was a small, neat, pointed black beard, a goatee. And his eyes were most marvelously bright. They seemed to be sparkling and twinkling at you all the time. The whole face, in fact, was alight with fun and laughter. And oh, how clever he looked! How quick and sharp and full of life! He kept making quick little movements with his head, cocking it this way and that, and taking everything in with those bright twinkling eyes. He was like a squirrel in the quickness of his movements, like a quick, clever old squirrel from the park. Suddenly, he did a funny little skipping dance in the snow, and he spread his arms wide, and he smiled at the 5 children who were standing near the gates, and he called out, "Welcome, my little friends. Welcome to the factory." His voice was very high. "Will you come forward one at a time, please," he called out, "and bring your parents. Then show me your golden ticket and give me your name. Who's first?" The big fat boy stepped up. "I'm Augustus Gloop," he said. "Augustus," cried Mr. Wonka, seizing his hand and pumping it up and down with terrific force. "My dear boy, how good to see you. Delighted. Charmed. Overjoyed to have you with us. And these are your parents? How nice. Come in. That's right. Step through the gates." Mr. Wonka was clearly just as excited as everybody else. "My name," said the next child to go forward, "is Veruca Salt." "My dear Veruca. How do you do? What a pleasure this is. You do have an interesting name, don't you? I always thought that a verruca was a sort of wart that you got on the sole of your foot. But I must be wrong, mustn't I? How pretty you look in that lovely mink coat. I'm so glad you could come. Dear me, this is going to be such an exciting day. I do hope you enjoy it. I'm sure you will. I know you will. Your father? How are you, Mr. Salt? And Mrs. Salt? Overjoyed to see you. Yes, the ticket is quite in order. Please go in." The next 2 children, Violet, Beauregard and Mike TV, came forward. Mr. Wonka examined their tickets and then he practically pumped their arms off their shoulders. And last of all, a small nervous voice whispered, "Charlie Bucket." "Charlie," cried Mr. Wonka. "Well, well, well. So there you are. You're the one who found your ticket only yesterday, aren't you?" "Yes, yes. I read all about it in this morning's papers. Just in time, my dear boy. I'm so glad. So happy for you. And this? Your grandfather? Delighted to meet you, sir. Overjoyed. All right. Excellent. Is everybody in now? 5 children? Yes. Good. Now will you please follow me? Our tour is about to begin. But do keep together. Please don't wander off by yourselves. I shouldn't like to lose any of you at this stage. Oh, dear me, no. Charlie glanced back over his shoulder and saw the great iron entrance gates slowly closing behind him. The crowds on the outside were still pushing and shouting. Charlie took a last look at them. Then, as the gates closed with a clang, all sight of the outside world disappeared. "Here we are," cried Mr. Wonka, walking along in front of the group. "Through this big red door, please." "That's right. It's nice and warm inside. I have to keep it warm inside the factory because of the workers. My workers are used to an extremely hot climate. They can't stand the cold. They'd die if they went outdoors in this weather. They'd freeze to death." "But who are these workers?" asked Augustus Gloop. "All in good time, my dear boy," said Mr. Wonka, smiling at Augustus. "Be patient. You shall see everything as we go along. Are all of you inside? Good. Would you mind closing the door? Thank you." Charlie Bucket found himself standing in a long corridor that stretched away in front of him as far as he could see. The corridor was so wide that a car could easily have been driven along it. The walls were pale pink, the lighting was soft and pleasant. "How lovely and warm," whispered Charlie. "I know." "And what a marvelous smell," answered Grandpa Joe, taking a long deep sniff. All the most wonderful smells in the world seemed to be mixed up in the air around them, the smell of roasting coffee and burnt sugar and melting chocolate and mint and violets and crushed hazelnuts and apple blossom and caramel and lemon peel. And far away in the distance, from the heart of the great factory, came a muffled roar of energy as though some monstrous gigantic machine were spinning its wheels at breakneck speed. "Now this, my dear children," said Mr. Wonka, raising his voice above the noise, "this is the main corridor. Will you please hang your coats and hats on those pegs over there, and then follow me? That's the way. Good. Everyone ready? Come on, then. Here we go." He went quickly down the corridor, and the visitors all hurried after him. It was quite a large party of people. There were 9 grown-ups and 5 children, 14 in all. So you can imagine that was a good deal of pushing and shoving as they hurried down the corridor, trying to keep up with the swift little figure in front of them. "Come on," cried Mr. Wonka. "Get a move on, please. We'll never get round today if you dawdle like this." Soon, he turned right off the main corridor into another slightly narrower passage. Then he turned left. Then left again. Then right. Then left. Then right. Then right. Then left. The place was like a gigantic rabbit warren with passages leading this way and that in every direction. "Don't you let go my hand, Charlie," whispered Grandpa Joe. "Notice now all these passages are sloping downwards," called out Mr. Wonka. "We are now going underground. All the most important rooms in my factory are deep down below the surface." "Why is that?" somebody asked. "There wouldn't be nearly enough space for them up on top," answered Mr. Wonka. "These rooms we are going to see are enormous. They're larger than football fields. No building in the world would be big enough for them. But down here, underneath the ground, I've got all the space I want. There's no limit so long as I hollow it out." Mr. Wonka turned right. He turned left. He turned right again. The passages were becoming steeper and steeper now. Then suddenly, Mr. Wonka stopped. In front of him, there was a shiny metal door. The party crowded round. On the door, in large letters, it said, "The Chocolate Room." Chapter 15. The Chocolate Room. "An important room, this," cried Mr. Wonka, taking a bunch of keys from his pocket and putting one into the keyhole of the door. "This is the nerve center of the whole factory, the heart of the whole business. And so beautiful. I insist upon my rooms being beautiful. I can't beat ugliness in factories. In we go, then. But do be careful, my dear children. Don't lose your heads. Don't get overexcited. Keep very calm." Mr. Wonka opened the door. 5 children and 9 grown-ups pushed their ways in, and oh, what an amazing sight it was that now met their eyes. They were looking down upon a lovely valley. There were green meadows on either side of the valley, and along the bottom of it there flowed great brown river. What is more, there was a tremendous waterfall halfway along the river, a steep cliff from which the water fell. Below the waterfall, and this was the most astonishing sight of all, a whole mass of enormous glass pipes were dangling down into the river from somewhere high up in the ceiling. They really were enormous, those pipes. There must have been a dozen of them at least, and they were sucking up the brownish muddy water from the river and carrying it away to goodness knows where. And because they were made of glass, you could see the liquid flowing and bubbling along inside them, and above the noise of the waterfall, you could hear the never-ending sucking sound of the pipes as they did their work. Graceful trees and bushes were growing along the river banks. In the meadows there were thousands of buttercups. There, cried Mr. Wonka, dancing up and down and pointing his gold-topped cane at the great brown river. "It's all chocolate. Every drop of that river is hot melted chocolate of the finest quality. The very finest quality. There's enough chocolate in there to fill every bathtub in the entire country. And all the swimming pools as well. Isn't it terrific? And just look at my pipes. They suck up the chocolate and carry it away to all the other rooms in the factory where it is needed. Thousands of gallons an hour, my dear children. Thousands and thousands of gallons." The children and their parents were too flabbergasted to speak. They were staggered. They were dumbfounded. They were bewildered and dazzled. They were completely bowled over by the hugeness of the whole thing. They simply stood and stared. "The waterfall is very important," Mr. Wonka went on. "It mixes the chocolate. It churns it up. It pounds it and beats it. It makes it light. No other factory in the world mixes its chocolate by waterfall. But it's the only way to do it properly. The only way. And do you like my trees?" he cried, pointing with his stick. "And my lovely bushes? Don't you think they look pretty? I told you I hated ugliness. And of course they are all eatable. All made of something different and delicious. And do you like my meadows? Do you like my grass and my buttercups? The grass you are standing on, my dear little ones, is made of a new kind of soft, minty sugar that I've just invented. Try a blade. Please do. It's delectable." Automatically, everybody bent down and picked one blade of grass, everybody, that is, except Augustus Gloop, who took a big handful. And Violet Beauregard, before tasting her blade of grass, took the piece of world record-breaking chewing gum out of her mouth and stuck it carefully behind her ear. "Isn't it wonderful?" whispered Charlie. "Hasn't it got a wonderful taste, Grandpa?" "I could eat the whole field," said Grandpa Joe, grinning with delight. "I could go around on all fours like a cow and eat every blade of grass in the field." "Try a buttercup," cried Mr. Wonka. "They're even nicer." Suddenly, the air was filled with screams of excitement. The screams came from Veruca Salt. She was pointing to the other side of the river. "Look! Look over there," she screamed. "What is it?" "He's moving. He's walking. It's a little person. It's a little man. Down there below the waterfall." Everybody stopped picking buttercups and stared across the river. "She's right," Grandpa cried Charlie. "It is a little man. Can you see him?" "I see him, Charlie," said Grandpa Joe excitedly. And now everybody started shouting at once. "There's two of them. There's more than two. There's 1, 2, 3, 4, 5. What are they doing? Where do they come from? Who are they?" Children and parents alike rushed down to the edge of the river to get a closer look. "Aren't they fantastic? No higher than my knee. Look at their funny long hair." The tiny men, they were no larger than medium-sized dolls, had stopped what they were doing, and now they were staring back across the river at the visitors. One of them pointed towards the children, and then he whispered something to the other 4, and all 5 of them burst into peals of laughter. "But they can't be real people," Charlie said. "Of course they're real people," Mr. Wonka answered. "They're Oompa Loompas." Chapter 16. The Oompa Loompas. "Oompa Loompas," everyone said at once. "Oompa Loompas. Imported direct from Loompaland," said Mr. Wonka proudly. "There's no such place," said Mrs. Salt. "Excuse me, dear lady, but—" "Mr. Wonka," cried Mrs. Salt. "I'm a teacher of geography." "Then you'll know all about it," said Mr. Wonka. "And oh, what a terrible country it is. Nothing but thick jungles infested by the most dangerous beasts in the world, hornswoggles and snoswainers and those terrible wicked whangdoodles. A whangdoodle would eat 10 Oompa Loompas for breakfast and come galloping back for a second helping. When I went out there, I found the little Oompa Loompas living in tree houses. They had to live in tree houses to escape from the whangdoodles and the hornswogglers and the snoswainers. And they were living on green caterpillars, and the caterpillars tasted revolting, and the Oompa Loompas spent every moment of their days climbing through the treetops looking for other things to mash up with the caterpillars to make them taste better. Red beetles, for instance, and eucalyptus leaves, and the bark of the bongbong tree, all of them beastly, but not quite so beastly as the caterpillars. Poor little Oompa Loompas! The one food that they longed for more than any other was the cacao bean. But they couldn't get it. An Oompa Loompa was lucky if he found 3 or 4 cacao beans a year. But oh, how they craved them! They used to dream about cacao beans all night and talk about them all day. You had only to mention the word cacao to an Oompa Loompa and he would start dribbling at the mouth. The cacao bean, Mr. Wonka continued, which grows on the cacao tree, happens to be the thing from which all chocolate is made. You cannot make chocolate without the cacao bean. The cacao bean is chocolate. I myself use billions of cacao beans every week in this factory. And so, my dear children, as soon as I discovered that the Oompa Loompas were crazy about this particular food, I climbed up to their treehouse village and poked my head in through the door of the treehouse belonging to the leader of the tribe. The poor little fellow, looking thin and starved, was sitting there trying to eat a bowl full of mashed-up green caterpillars without being sick. "Look here," I said, speaking not in English, of course, but in Oompa Loompish. "Look here, if you and all your people come back to my country and live in my factory, you can have all the cacao beans you want. I've got mountains of them in my storehouse. You can have cacao beans for every meal. I'll even pay your wages in cacao beans if you wish." "You really mean it?" asked the Oompa Loompa leader, leaping up from his chair. "Of course I mean it," I said. "And you can have chocolate as well. Chocolate tastes even better than cacao beans because it's got milk and sugar added." The little man gave a great whoop of joy and threw his bowl of mashed caterpillars right out of the treehouse window. "It's a deal," he cried. "Come on. Let's go." So I shipped them all over here, every man, woman, and child in the Oompa Loompa tribe. It was easy. I smuggled them over in large packing cases with holes in them, and they all got here safely. They are wonderful workers. They all speak English now. They love dancing and music. They are always making up songs. I expect you will hear a good deal of singing today from time to time. I must warn you, though, that they are rather mischievous. They like jokes. They still wear the same kind of clothes they wore in the jungle. They insist upon that. The men, as you can see for yourselves across the river, wear only deerskins. The women wear leaves, and the children wear nothing at all. The women use fresh leaves every day. "Daddy," shouted Veruca Salt, the girl who got everything she wanted. "Daddy, I want an Oompa Loompa. I want you to get me an Oompa Loompa. I want an Oompa Loompa right away. I want to take it home with me. Go on, Daddy. Get me an Oompa Loompa." Now, my pet," her father said to her, "we mustn't interrupt Mr. Wonka." "But I want an Oompa Loompa," screamed Veruca. "All right, Veruca, all right. But I can't get it for you this second. Please be patient. I'll see you have one before the day is out." "Augustus," shouted Mrs. Gloop. "Augustus, sweetheart, don't do that." Augustus Gloop, as you might have guessed, had quietly sneaked down to the edge of the river, and he was now kneeling on the riverbank, scooping hot melted chocolate into his mouth as fast as he could. Chapter 17. Augustus Gloop Goes Up the Pipe. When Mr. Wonka turned round and saw what Augustus Gloop was doing, he cried out, "Oh, no. Please, Augustus, please. I beg of you not to do that. My chocolate must be untouched by human hands." "Augustus," called out Mrs. Gloop. "Didn't you hear what the man said? Come away from that river at once. This stuff is fabulous," said Augustus, taking not the slightest notice of his mother or Mr. Wonka. "Gosh, I need a bucket to drink it properly." "Augustus," cried Mr. Wonka, hopping up and down and waving his stick in the air, "you must come away. You are dirtying my chocolate." "Augustus," cried Mrs. Gloop. "Augustus," cried Mr. Gloop. But Augustus was deaf to everything except the call of his enormous stomach. He was now lying full length on the ground with his head far out over the river, lapping up the chocolate like a dog. "Augustus," shouted Mrs. Gluck. "You'll be giving that nasty cold of yours to about 1,000,000 people all over the country." "Be careful, Augustus," shouted Mr. Gluck. "You're leaning too far out." Mr. Gluck was absolutely right. For suddenly, there was a shriek, and then a splash, and Augustus Gluck went into the river, and in 1 second he had disappeared under the brown surface. "Save him," screamed Mrs. Gluck, going white in the face, and waving her umbrella about. "He'll drown. He can't swim a yard. Save him. Save him." "Good heavens, woman," said Mr. Gluck, "I'm not diving in there. I've got my best suit on." Augustus Gluck's face came up again to the surface, painted brown with chocolate. "Help! Help! Help!" he yelled. "Fish me out! Don't just stand there." Mrs. Gluck screamed at Mr. Gluck. "Do something." "I am doing something," said Mr. Gluck, who was now taking off his jacket and getting ready to dive into the chocolate. But while he was doing this, the wretched boy was being sucked closer and closer towards the mouth of one of the great pipes that was dangling down into the river. Then all at once, he was pulled under the surface and then into the mouth of the pipe. The crowd on the riverbank waited breathlessly to see where he would come out. "There he goes," somebody shouted, pointing upwards. And sure enough, because the pipe was made of glass, Augustus Gluck could be clearly seen shooting up inside it, head first, like a torpedo. "Help! Murder! Police!" screamed Mrs. Gluck. "Augustus, come back at once. Where are you going?" "It's a wonder to me," said Mr. Gluck, "how that pipe is big enough for him to go through it." "It isn't big enough," said Charlie Bucket. "Oh dear, look. He's slowing down." "So he is," said Grandpa Joe. "He's going to stick," said Charlie. "I think he is," said Grandpa Joe. "By golly, he has stuck," said Charlie. "It's his stomach that's done it," said Mr. Gluck. "He's blocked the whole pipe," said Grandpa Joe. "Smash the pipe," yelled Mrs. Gluck, still waving her umbrella. "Augustus, come out of there at once." The watchers below could see the chocolate building up behind the boy in a solid mass, and pushing against the blockage. The pressure was terrific. Something had to give. Something did give, and that something was Augustus. Hoof! Up he shot again like a bullet in the barrel of gun. "He's disappeared," yelled Mrs. Gluck. "Where does that pipe go to? Quick! Call the fire brigade." "Keep calm," cried Mr. Wonka. "Keep calm, my dear lady, keep calm. There is no danger. No danger whatsoever. Augustus has gone on a little journey, that's all. A most interesting little journey. But he'll come out of it just fine, you wait and see." "How can he possibly come out just fine?" snapped Mrs. Gluck. "He'll be made into marshmallows in 5 seconds. "Impossible," cried Mr. Wonka. "Unthinkable. Absurd. He could never be made into marshmallows." "And why not, may I ask?" shouted Mrs. Gluck. "Because that pipe doesn't go anywhere near it. That pipe, the one Augustus went up, happens to lead directly to the room where I make a most delicious kind of strawberry-flavored chocolate-coated fudge. Then he'll be made into strawberry-flavored chocolate-coated fudge, screamed Mrs. Gluck. My poor Augustus. They'll be selling him by the pound all over the country tomorrow morning. Quite right, said Mr. Gluck. I know I'm right, said Mrs. Gluck. It's not a joke, said Mr. Gluck. Mr. Wonka doesn't seem to think so, cried Mrs. Gluck. Just look at him. He's laughing his head off. How dare you laugh like that when my boy's just gone up the pipe? You monster, she shrieked, pointing her umbrella at Mr. Wonka as though she were going to run him through. You think it's a joke, do you? You think that sucking my boy up into your fudge room like that is just one great big colossal joke? He'll be perfectly safe, said Mr. Wonka, giggling slightly. He'll be chocolate fudge, shrieked Mrs. Gluck. Never, cried Mr. Wonka. Of course he will, shrieked Mrs. Gluck. I wouldn't allow it, cried Mr. Wonka. And why not, shrieked Mrs. Gluck. Because the taste would be terrible, said Mr. Wonka. Just imagine it. Augustus-flavored chocolate-coated Gluck. No one would buy it. They most certainly would, cried Mr. Gluck indignantly. I don't want to think about it, shrieked Mrs. Gluck. Nor do I, said Mr. Wonka. And I do promise you, madam, that your darling boy is perfectly safe. If he's perfectly safe, then where is he? Snapped Mrs. Gluck. Lead me to him this instant. Mr. Wonka turned around and clicked his fingers sharply, click, 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 3 times. Immediately, an Oompa Loompa appeared, as if from nowhere, and stood beside him. The Oompa Loompa bowed and smiled, showing beautiful white teeth. His skin was rosy white, his long hair was golden brown, and the top of his head came just above the height of Mr. Wonka's knee. He wore the usual deerskin. Now listen to me, said Mr. Wonka, looking down at the tiny man. I want you to take Mr. and Mrs. Gluck up to the fudge room and help them to find their son, Augustus. He's just gone up the pipe. The Oompa Loompa took one look at Mrs. Gluck and exploded into peals of laughter. Oh, do be quiet, said Mr. Wonka. Control yourself. Pull yourself together. Mrs. Gluck doesn't think it's at all funny. You can say that again, said Mrs. Gluck. Go straight to the fudge room, Mr. Wonka said to the Oompa Loompa, and when you get there, take a long stick and start poking around inside the big chocolate mixing barrel. I'm almost certain you'll find him in there. But you'd better look sharp. You'll have to hurry. If you leave him in the chocolate mixing barrel too long, he'll be poured out into the fudge boiler, and that really would be a disaster, wouldn't it? My fudge would become quite uneatable. Mrs. Gluck let out a shriek of fury. I'm joking, said Mr. Wonka, giggling madly behind his beard. I didn't mean it. Forgive me. I'm so sorry. Goodbye, Mrs. Gluck. And Mr. Gluck. Goodbye. I'll see you later. As Mr. and Mrs. Gluck and their tiny escort hurried away, the 5 Oompa Loompas on the far side of the river suddenly began hopping and dancing about and beating wildly upon a number of very small drums. Augustus Gluck, they chanted. Augustus Gluck. Augustus Gluck. Augustus Gluck. Grandpa, cried Charlie, Listen to them, Grandpa. What are they doing? SSSHH, whispered Grandpa Joe. I think they're going to sing us a song. Augustus Gloop, sang the Oompa Loompas. Augustus Gloop. Augustus Gloop. The great big greedy nincompoop. How long could we allow this beast to gorge and guzzle, feed and feast on everything he wanted to? Great Scott! It simply wouldn't do. He'll be quite changed from what he's been when he goes through the fudge machine. We boil him for a minute more until we're absolutely sure that all the greed and all the gall is boiled away for once and all. I told you they loved singing, cried Mr. Wonka. Aren't they delightful? Aren't they charming? But you mustn't believe a word they said. It's all nonsense, every bit of it. Are the Oompa Loompas really joking, Grandpa? Asked Charlie. Of course they're joking, answered Grandpa Joe. They must be joking. At least, I hope they're joking. Don't you? Chapter 18. Down the Chocolate River. Off we go, cried Mr. Wonka. Hurry up, everybody. Follow me to the next room. And please don't worry about Augustus Gloop. He's bound to come out in the wash, they always do. We shall have to make the next part of the journey by boat. Here she comes. Look. A steamy mist was rising up now from the great warm chocolate river, and out of the mist there appeared suddenly a most fantastic pink boat. It was a large open shining rowboat with a tall front and a tall back, like an old Viking boat. There were many oars on either side of it, and as the boat came closer, the watchers on the riverbank could see that the oars were being pulled by masses of Oompa Loompas, at least 10 of them to each oar. This is my private yacht, cried Mr. Wonka, beaming with pleasure. I made her by hollowing out an enormous boiled sweet. Isn't she beautiful? See how she comes cutting through the river. The gleaming pink boiled sweet boat glided up to the riverbank. 100 Oompa Loompas rested on their oars and stared up at the visitors. Then suddenly, for some reason best known to themselves, they all burst into shrieks of laughter. What's so funny? Asked Violet Beauregard. Oh, don't worry about them, cried Mr. Wonka. They're always laughing. They think everything's a colossal joke. Jump into the boat, all of you. Come on. Hurry up. As soon as everyone was safely in, the Oompa Loompas pushed the boat away from the bank and began to row swiftly downriver. Hey, there. Mike TV, shouted Mr. Wonka. Please do not lick the boat with your tongue. It'll only make it sticky. Daddy, said Veruca Salt, I want a boat like this. I want you to buy me a big pink boiled sweet boat exactly like Mr. Wonka's. And I want lots of Oompa Loompas to row me about, and I want a chocolate river, and I want. She wants a good kick in the pants, whispered Grandpa Joe to Charlie. The old man was sitting in the back of the boat and little Charlie Bucket was right beside him. Charlie was holding tightly onto his grandfather's bony old hand. He was so excited. Everything that he had seen so far, the great chocolate river, the waterfall, the huge sucking pipes, the minty sugar meadows, the Oompa Loompas, the beautiful pink boat, and most of all, Mr. Willy Wonka himself had been so astonishing that he began to wonder whether there could possibly be any more astonishments left. Where were they going now? What were they going to see? And what in the world was going to happen in the next room? "Isn't it marvelous?" said Grandpa Joe, grinning at Charlie. Charlie nodded and smiled up at the old man. Suddenly, Mr. Wonka, who was sitting on Charlie's other side, reached down into the bottom of the boat, picked up a large mug, dipped it into the river, filled it with chocolate, and handed it to Charlie. "Drink this," he said. "It'll do you good. You look starved to death." Then Mr. Wonka filled a second mug and gave it to Grandpa Joe. "You, too," he said. "You look like a skeleton. What's the matter? Hasn't there been anything to eat in your house lately?" "Not much," said Grandpa Joe. Charlie put the mug to his lips, and as the rich warm creamy chocolate ran down his throat into his empty tummy, his whole body from head to toe began to tingle with pleasure, and a feeling of intense happiness spread over him. "You like it?" asked Mr. Wonka. "Oh, it's wonderful," Charlie said. "The creamiest, loveliest chocolate I've ever tasted," said Grandpa Joe, smacking his lips. "That's because it's been mixed by a waterfall," Mr. Wonka told him. The boat sped on down the river. The river was getting narrower. There was some kind of a dark tunnel ahead, a great round tunnel that looked like an enormous pipe, and the river was running right into the tunnel. And so was the boat. "Row on," shouted Mr. Wonka, jumping up and waving his stick in the air. "Full speed ahead." And with the Oompa Loompas rowing faster than ever, the boat shot into the dark tunnel, and all the passengers screamed with excitement. "How can they see where they're going?" shrieked Violet Beauregard in the darkness. "There's no knowing where they're going," cried Mr. Wonka, laughing. "He's gone off his rocker," shouted one of the fathers, and the other parents joined in the chorus of frightened shouting. "He's crazy," they shouted. "He's balmy. He's nutty. He's screwy. He's batty. He's dippy. He's dotty. He's daffly. He's goofy. He's beany. He's buggy. He's wacky. He's loony." "No, he is no," said Grandpa Joe. "Switch on the lights," shouted Mr. Wonka. And suddenly, the lights came on, and Charlie could see that they were indeed inside a gigantic pipe, and the great walls of the pipe were pure white and spotlessly clean. The river of chocolate was flowing very fast inside the pipe, and the Oompa Loompas were all rowing like mad, and the boat was rocketing along at a furious pace. Mr. Wonka was jumping up and down in the back of the boat and calling to the rowers to grow faster and faster still. He seemed to love the sensation of whizzing through a white tunnel in a pink boat on a chocolate river, and he clapped his hands and laughed and kept glancing at his passengers to see if they were enjoying it as much as he. "Look, Grandpa," cried Charlie. "There's a door in the wall." It was a green door, and it was set into the wall of the tunnel just above the level of the river. As they flashed past it, there was just enough time to read the writing on the door. "Storeroom number 54, it said. "All the creams: dairy cream, whipped cream, violet cream, coffee cream, pineapple cream, vanilla cream, and hair cream." "Hair cream?" cried Mike TV. "You don't use hair cream?" "Row on," shouted Mr. Wonka. "There's no time to answer silly questions." They flashed past a black door. "Storeroom number 71, it said on it. Whips all shapes and sizes." "Whips," cried Veruca Salt. What on earth do you use whips for? For whipping cream, of course, said Mr. Wonka. How can you whip cream without whips? There's no time for arguing. Press on, press on. But 5 seconds later, when a bright red door came into sight ahead, he suddenly waved his gold-topped cane in the air and shouted, "Stop the boat!" Chapter 19. The Inventing Room, Everlasting Gobstoppers and Hair Toffee. When Mr. Wonka shouted "Stop the boat," the Oompa Loompa jammed their oars into the river and backed water furiously. The boat stopped. The Oompa Loompas guided the boat alongside the red door. On the door it said, "Inventing Room Private, Keep Out." Mr. Wonka took a key from his pocket, leaned over the side of the boat, and put the key in the keyhole. "This is the most important room in the entire factory," he said. "All my most secret new inventions are cooking in here." Old Ficklegribber would give his front teeth to be allowed inside just for 3 minutes. So would Prodnose and Slugworth and all the other rotten chocolate makers. But now, listen to me. I want no messing about when you go in. No touching, and no tasting. Is that agreed? Yes, yes, the children cried. We won't touch a thing. Up to now, Mr. Wonka said, nobody else, not even an Oompa Loompa, has ever been allowed in here. He opened the door and stepped out of the boat into the room. The 4 children and their parents all went after him. "Don't touch," shouted Mr. Wonka. "And don't knock anything over." Charlie Bucket stared around the gigantic room in which he now found himself. The place was like a witch's kitchen. All about him black metal pots were boiling and bubbling on huge stoves, and kettles were hissing and pans were sizzling, and strange iron machines were clanking, and there were pipes running all over the ceiling and walls, and the whole place was filled with smoke and steam and delicious rich smells. Mr. Wonka himself had suddenly become even more excited than usual, and anyone could see that this was the room he loved best of all. He was hopping about among the saucepans and the machines like a child among his Christmas presents, not knowing which thing to look at first. He lifted the lid from a huge pot and took a sniff, then he rushed over and dipped a finger into a barrel of sticky yellow stuff and had a taste. Then he skipped across to one of the machines and turned half a dozen knobs this way and that. Then he peered through the glass door of a gigantic oven, rubbing his hands and cackling with delight at what he saw inside. Then he ran over to another machine, a small shiny affair that kept going fut 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 fut, and every time it went fut, a large green marble dropped out of it into a basket on the floor. At least it looked like a marble. "Everlasting gobstoppers," cried Mr. Wonka proudly. "They're completely new. I am inventing them for children who are given very little pocket money. You can put an everlasting gobstopper in your mouth and you can suck it and suck it and suck it and suck it and it will never get any smaller." "It's like gum," cried Violet Beauregard. "It is not like gum," Mr. Wonka said. "Gum is for chewing, and if you try chewing one of these gobstoppers here you'll break your teeth off. And they never get any smaller. They never disappear. Never. At least I don't think they do. There's one of them being tested this very moment in the testing room next door. And Oompa Loompa is sucking it. He's been sucking it for very nearly a year now without stopping, and it's still just as good as ever. Now, over here," Mr. Wonka went on, skipping excitedly across the room to the opposite wall, "over here I am inventing a completely new line in toffees." He stopped beside a large saucepan. The saucepan was full of a thick treacle, boiling and bubbling. By standing on his toes, little Charlie could just see inside it. "That's hair toffee," cried Mr. Wonka. "You eat just one tiny bit of that, and in exactly half an hour brand new thick silky beautiful hair will start growing out all over the top of your head. And a mustache. And a beard." "A beard," cried Veruca Salt. "Who wants a beard, for heaven's sake?" "It would suit you very well," said Mr. Wonka, "but unfortunately the mixture is not quite right yet. I've got it too strong. It works too well. I tried it on an Oompa Loompa yesterday in the testing room, and immediately a huge black beard started shooting out of his chin, and the beard grew so fast that soon it was trailing all over the floor in a thick hairy carpet. It was growing faster than we could cut it. In the end we had to use a lawnmower. But I'll get the mixture right soon. And when I do, then there'll be no excuse anymore for little boys and girls going about with bald heads." "But Mr. Wonka," said Mike TV, "little boys and girls never do go about with—" "Don't argue, my dear child, please don't argue," cried Mr. Wonka. "It's such a waste of precious time. Now, over here, if you will all step this way, I will show you something that I am terrifically proud of. Oh, do be careful. Don't knock anything over. Stand back." Chapter 20. The Great Gum Machine. Mr. Wonka led the party over to a gigantic machine that stood in the very center of the inventing room. It was a mountain of metal that stood high above the children and their parents. Out of the very top of it there sprouted hundreds and hundreds of thin glass tubes. They all went downwards and came together in a bunch and hung over an enormous round tub as big as a bath. "Here we go," cried Mr. Wonka, and he pressed 3 different buttons on the side of the machine. A second later, a loud sound came from inside it, and the whole machine began to shake most frighteningly, and steam began hissing out of it all over, and then suddenly the watchers noticed that runny stuff was pouring down the insides of all the hundreds of little glass tubes and squirting out into the great tub below. And in every single tube the runny stuff was of a different color, so that all the colors of the rainbow, and many others as well, came splashing into the tub. It was a lovely sight. And when the tub was nearly full, Mr. Wonka pressed another button, and immediately the runny stuff disappeared, and then a giant whizzer started whizzing round inside the enormous tub, mixing up all the different colored liquids like an ice cream soda. Gradually, the mixture began to froth. It turned from blue to white to green to brown to yellow, then back to blue again. "Watch," said Mr. Wonka. The machine clicked, and the whizzer stopped whizzing. And now there came a sort of sucking noise, and very quickly all the blue frothy mixture in the huge basin was sucked back into the stomach of the machine. Then was a moment of silence. Then a few strange rumblings were heard. Then silence again. Then suddenly, the machine let out a monstrous mighty groan, and at the same moment a tiny drawer, no bigger than the drawer in a slot machine, popped out of the side of the machine, and in the drawer there lay something so small and thin and gray that everyone thought it must be a mistake. The thing looked like a little strip of gray cardboard. The children and their parents stared at the little gray strip lying in the drawer. "You mean that's all?" said Mike TV. "That's all," answered Mr. Wonka, gazing proudly at the result. "Don't you know what it is?" There was a pause. Then suddenly, Violet Beauregard, the silly gum-chewing girl, let out a yell of excitement. "By gum, it's gum right you're," cried Mr. Wonka, slapping Violet hard on the back. "It's a stick of gum. It's a stick of the most amazing and fabulous and sensational gum in the world." Chapter 21. Goodbye, Violet. "This guy," Mr. Wonka went on, "is my latest, my greatest, my most fascinating invention. It's a chewing gum meal. That tiny little strip of gum lying there is a whole 3-course dinner." "What sort of nonsense is this?" said one of the fathers. "My dear sir," cried Mr. Wonka, "when I start selling this gum in the shops it will change everything. It will be the end of all kitchens and all cooking. There will be no more shopping to do. No more buying of meat and groceries. There'll be no knives and forks at mealtimes. No plates. No washing up. No rubbish. No mess. Just a little strip of Wonka's magic chewing gum, and that's all you'll ever need at breakfast, lunch, and supper. This piece of gum I've just made happens to be tomato soup, roast beef, and blueberry pie, but you can have almost anything you want." "What do you mean, it's tomato soup, roast beef, and blueberry pie?" said Violet Beauregard. "If you start chewing it," said Mr. Wonka, "then that is exactly what you will get on the menu. It's absolutely amazing. You can actually feel the food going down your throat and into your tummy. And you can taste it perfectly. And it fills you up. It satisfies you. It's terrific." "It's impossible," said Veruca Salt. "Just so long as it's gum," shouted Violet Beauregard, "just so long as it's a piece of gum and I can chew it, then that's for me." And quickly she took her own world record piece of chewing gum out of her mouth and stuck it behind her left ear. "Come on, Mr. Wonka," she said, "hand over this magic gum of yours and we'll see if the thing works." "Now, Violet," said Mrs. Beauregard, her mother, "don't let's do anything silly, Violet." "I want the gum," Violet said obstinately. "What's so silly?" "I would rather you didn't take it," Mr. Wonka told her gently. "You see, I haven't got it quite right yet. There are still 1 or 2 things." "Oh, to blazes with that," said Violet, and suddenly, before Mr. Wonka could stop her, she shot out a fat hand and grabbed the stick of gum out of the little drawer and popped it into her mouth. At once, her huge, well-trained jaws started chewing away on it. "Don't," said Mr. Wonka. "Fabulous," shouted Violet. "It's tomato soup. It's hot and creamy and delicious. I can feel it running down my throat." "Stop," said Mr. Wonka. "The gum isn't ready yet. It's not right." "Of course it's right," said Violet. "It's working beautifully. Oh my, what lovely soup this is." "Spit it out," said Mr. Wonka. "It's changing," shouted Violet, chewing and grinning both at the same time. "The second course is coming up. It's roast beef. It's tender and juicy. The baked potato is marvelous, too. It's got a crispy skin and it's all filled with butter inside." "But how interesting, Violet," said Mrs. Beauregard. "You are a clever girl." "Keep chewing, baby," said Mr. Beauregard. "Keep right on chewing. This is a great day for the Beauregards. Our little girl is the first person in the world to have a chewing gum meal." Everybody was watching Violet Beauregard as she stood there chewing this extraordinary gum. Little Charlie Bucket was staring at her absolutely spellbound, watching her huge rubbery lips as they pressed and unpressed with the chewing, and Grandpa Joe stood beside him, gaping at the girl. Mr. Wonka was just saying, "No, no, 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 no. It isn't ready for eating. It isn't right. You mustn't do it." "Blueberry pie and cream," shouted Violet. "Here it comes. Oh my, it's perfect. It's beautiful. It's exactly as though I'm swallowing it. It's as though I'm chewing and swallowing great big spoonfuls of the most marvelous blueberry pie in the world." "Good heavens, girl," shrieked Mrs. Beauregard suddenly, staring at Violet, "what's happening to your nose?" "Oh, be quiet, Mother, and let me finish," said Violet. "It's turning blue," screamed Mrs. Beauregard. "Your nose is turning blue as a blueberry." "Your mother is right," shouted Mr. Beauregard. "Your whole nose has gone purple." "What do you mean?" said Violet, still chewing away. "Your cheeks," screamed Mrs. Beauregard. "They're turning blue as well. So is your chin. Your whole face is turning blue." "Spit that gum out at once," ordered Mr. Beauregard. "Please. Save us," yelled Mrs. Beauregard. "The girl's turning blue and purple all over. Even her hair is changing color. Violet, you're turning violet, Violet. What is happening to you?" "I told you I hadn't got it quite right," sighed Mr. Wonka, shaking his head sadly. "I'll say you haven't," cried Mrs. Beauregard. "Just look at the girl now." Everybody was staring at Violet. And what a terrible sight she was. Her face and hands and legs and neck, in fact the skin all over her body, as well as her great big mop of curly hair, had turned a brilliant, purplish blue, the color of blueberry juice. "It always goes wrong when we come to the dessert," sighed Mr. Wonka. "It's the blueberry pie that does it. But I'll get it right one day, you wait and see." "Violet," screamed Mrs. Beauregard, "you're swelling up." "I feel most peculiar," gasped Violet. "I'm not surprised," said Mr. Beauregard. "Great heavens, girl," screamed Mrs. Beauregard. "You're blowing up like a balloon." "Like a blueberry," said Mr. Wonka. "Call a doctor," shouted Mr. Beauregard. "Prick her with a pin," said one of the other fathers. "Save her," cried Mrs. Beauregard, wringing her hands. But there was no saving her now. Her body was swelling up and changing shape at such a rate that within a minute it had turned into an enormous round blue ball, a gigantic blueberry, in fact, and all that remained of Violet Beauregard herself was a tiny pair of legs and a tiny pair of arms sticking out of the great round fruit and little head on top. "It always happens like that," sighed Mr. Wonka. "I've tried it 20 times in the testing room on 20 Oompa Loompa, and every one of them finished up as a blueberry. It's most annoying. I just can't understand it." "But I don't want a blueberry for a daughter," yelled Mrs. Beauregard. "Put her back to what she was this instant." Mr. Wonka clicked his fingers, and 10 Oompa Loompas appeared immediately at his side. "Roll Miss Beauregard into the boat," he said to them, "and take her along to the juicing room at once." "The juicing room?" cried Mrs. Beauregard. "What are they going to do to her there?" "Squeeze her," said Mr. Wonka. "We've got to squeeze the juice out of her immediately. After that, we'll just have to see how she comes out." But don't worry, my dear Mrs. Beauregard. We'll get her repaired. I am sorry about it all, I really am. Already the 10 Oompa Loompas were rolling the enormous blueberry across the floor of the inventing room towards the door that led to the chocolate river where the boat was waiting. Mr. and Mrs. Beauregard hurried after them. The rest of the party, including little Charlie Bucket and Grandpa Joe, stood absolutely still and watched them go. "Listen," whispered Charlie. "Listen, Grandpa. The Oompa Loompas in the boat outside are starting to sing." The voices, 100 of them singing together, came loud and clear into the room. "Dear friends, we surely all agree. There's almost nothing worse to see than some repulsive little bum who's always chewing gum. Did any of you ever know a person called Miss Bigelow? This dreadful woman saw no wrong in chewing all day long. She chewed while bathing in the tub. She chewed while dancing in the dub. She went on chewing till, at last, her chewing muscles grew so vast, until at least her jaws decide to pause and open extra wide. And with the most tremendous chew, they bit the lady's tongue in two. Thereafter, just from chewing gum, Miss Bigelow was always dumb. And that's why we try so hard to save Miss Violet Beauregard from suffering an equal fate. She's still quite young. It's not too late. Chapter 22. Along the Corridor. Well, sighed Mr. Willy Wonka, 2 naughty little children gone. 3 good little children left. I think we'd better get out of this room quickly before we lose anyone else. But Mr. Wonka, said Charlie Bucket anxiously, will Violet Beauregard ever be all right again, or will she always be a blueberry? They'll dejuice her very quickly, declared Mr. Wonka. They'll roll her into the dejuicing machine, and she'll come out as thin as a whistle. But will she still be blue all over? Asked Charlie. She'll be purple? Cried Mr. Wonka. A fine rich purple from head to toe. But there you are. That's what comes from chewing disgusting gum all day long. If you think gum is so disgusting, said Mike TV, then why do you make it in your factory? I do wish you wouldn't mumble, said Mr. Wonka. I can't hear a word you're saying. Come on. Off we go. Hurry up. Follow me. We're going into the corridors again. And so saying, Mr. Wonka hurried across to the far end of the inventing room and went out through a small secret door hidden behind a lot of pipes and stoves. The 3 remaining children, Veruca Salt, Mike TV, and Charlie Bucket, together with the 5 remaining grown-ups, followed after him. Charlie Bucket saw that they were now back in one of those long pink corridors with many other pink corridors leading out of it. Mr. Wonka was rushing along in front, turning left and right and left, and Grandpa Joe was saying, "Keep a good hold of my hand, Charlie. It would be terrible to get lost in here." Mr. Wonka was saying, "No time for any more messing about. We'll never get anywhere at the rate we've been going." And on he rushed, down the endless pink corridors. They passed a door in the wall. "No time to go in," shouted Mr. Wonka. "Press on." They passed another door, then another and another. There were doors every 20 paces or so along the corridor now, and they all had something written on them, and strange clanking noises were coming from behind several of them, and delicious smells were coming through the keyholes. Grandpa Joe and Charlie were half running and half walking to keep up with Mr. Wonka, but they were able to read what it said on quite a few of the doors as they hurried by. Eatable marshmallow pillows, it said on one. "Marshmallow pillows are terrific," shouted Mr. Wonka as he dashed by. "They'll be all the rage when I get them into the snoops. No time to go in, though. No time to go in." Lickable wallpaper for nurseries, it said on the next door. "Lovely stuff, lickable wallpaper," cried Mr. Wonka, rushing past. "It has pictures of fruits on it: bananas, apples, oranges, grapes, pineapples, strawberries, and snozzbeanies." "Snozzberries?" said Mike TV. "Don't interrupt," said Mr. Wonka. "The wallpaper has pictures of all these fruits printed on it, and when you lick the picture of a banana, it tastes of banana. When you lick a strawberry, it tastes of strawberry. And when you lick a snozzberry, it tastes just exactly like a snozzberry. But what does a snozzberry taste like?" "You're mumbling again," said Mr. Wonka. "Speak louder next time. On we go. Hurry up." "Hot ice creams for cold days," it said on the next door. "Extremely useful in the winter," said Mr. Wonka, rushing on. "Hot ice cream warms you up in freezing weather. I also make hot ice cubes for putting in hot drinks. Hot ice cubes make hot drinks hotter. Cows that give chocolate milk," it said on the next door. "Ah, my pretty little cows," cried Mr. Wonka. "How I love those cows." "But why can't we see them?" asked Veruca Salt. "Why do we have to go rushing on past all these lovely rooms?" "We shall stop in time," called out Mr. Wonka. "Don't be so madly impatient." "Fizzy lifting drinks," it said on the next door. "Oh, those are fabulous," cried Mr. Wonka. "They fill you with bubbles, and the bubbles are full of a special kind of gas, and this gas is so terrifically lifting that it lifts you right off the ground just like a balloon, and up you go until your head hits the ceiling, and there you stay." "But how do you come down again?" asked little Charlie. "You do a burp, of course," said Mr. Wonka. "You do a great big long rude burp, and up comes the gas and down comes you. But don't drink it outdoors. There's no knowing how high up you'll be carried if you do that. I gave some to an old Oompa Loompa once out in the backyard, and he went up and disappeared put of sight. It was very sad. I never saw him again." "He should have burped," Charlie said. "Of course he should have burped," said Mr. Wonka. "I stood there shouting, 'Burp, or you'll never come down again.' But he didn't or couldn't or wouldn't, I don't know which. Maybe he was too polite. He must be on the moon by now." On the next door, it said, "Square sweets that look round." "Wait," cried Mr. Wonka, suddenly stopping. "I am very proud of my square sweets that look round. Let's take a peek." Chapter 23. Square sweets that look round. Everybody stopped and went to the door. The top half of the door was made of glass. Grandpa Joe lifted Charlie up so that he could get a better view, and looking in, Charlie saw a long table, and on the table there were rows and rows of small white square sweets. The sweets looked very much like square sugar lumps, except that each of them had a funny little pink face painted on one side. At the end of the table, a number of Oompa Loompas were busily painting more faces on more sweets. "There you are," cried Mr. Wonka. Square sweets that look round. They don't look round to me, said Mike TV. They look square, said Veruca Salt. They look absolutely square. But they are square, said Mr. Wonka. I never said they weren't. You said they were round, said Veruca Salt. I never said anything of the sort, said Mr. Wonka. I said they looked round. But they don't look round, said Veruca Salt. They look square. They look round, insisted Mr. Wonka. They most certainly do not look round, cried Veruca Salt. Veruca, darling, said Mrs. Salt, pay no attention to Mr. Wonka. He's lying to you. My dear old fish, said Mr. Wonka, go and boil your head. How dare you speak to me like that, shouted Mrs. Salt. Oh, do shut up, said Mr. Wonka. Now watch this. He took a key from his pocket, and unlocked the door, and opened it, and suddenly, at the sound of the door opening, all the rows of little square sweets looked quickly round to see who was coming in. The tiny faces actually turned towards the door and stared at Mr. Wonka. There you are, he cried triumphantly. They're looking round. There's no argument about it. They are square sweets that look round. By golly, he's right, said Grandpa Joe. Come on, said Mr. Wonka, starting off down the corridor again. On we go. We mustn't dawdle. Butterscotch and buttergin, it said on the next door the past. Now that sounds a bit more interesting, said Mr. Salt, Veruca's father. Great stuff, said Mr. Wonka. The Oompa Loompas all adore it. It makes them tidily. Listen. Shrieks of laughter and snatches of singing could be heard coming through the closed door. They're drunk as lords, said Mr. Wonka. They're drinking butterscotch and soda. They like that best of all. Butter gin and tonic is also very popular. Follow me, please. We really mustn't stop like this. He turned left. He turned right. They came to a long flight of stairs. Mr. Wonka slid down the banisters. The three children did the same. Mrs. Salt and Mrs. TV, the only women now left in the party, were getting very out of breath. Mrs. Salt was a great fat creature with short legs, and she was blowing like a rhinoceros. This way, cried Mr. Wonka, turning left at the bottom of the stairs. Go slowed, panted Mrs. Salt. Impossible, said Mr. Wonka. We should never get there in time if I did. Get where? Asked Veruca Salt. Never you mind, said Mr. Wonka. You just wait and see. Chapter 24. Veruca in the Nut Room. Mr. Wonka rushed on down the corridor. The Nut Room, it said on the next door they came to. All right, said Mr. Wonka, stop here for a moment and catch your breath, and take a peek through the glass panel of this door. But don't go in. Whatever you do, don't go into the Nut Room. If you go in, you'll disturb the squirrels. Everyone crowded around the door. Oh look, Grandpa, look, cried Charlie. Squirrels, shouted Veruca Salt. Crikey, said Mike TV. It was an amazing sight. 100 squirrels sat on high stools around a large table. On the table, there were mounds and mounds of walnuts, and the squirrels were all working away like mad, shelling the walnuts at a great speed. These squirrels are specially trained for getting the nuts out of walnuts, Mr. Wonka explained. Why use squirrels? Mike TV asked. Why not use Oompa Loompas? Because, said Mr. Wonka, Oompa Loompas can't get walnuts out of walnut shells in one piece. They always break them in two. Nobody except squirrels can get walnuts whole out of walnut shells every time. It is extremely difficult. But in my factory, I insist upon only whole walnuts. Therefore, I have to have squirrels to do the job. Aren't they wonderful? See how they get those nuts out. And see how they first tap each walnut with their knuckles to be sure it's not a bad one. If it's bad, it makes a hollow sound, and they don't open it. They just throw it down the rubbish chute. There. Look. Watch that squirrel nearest to us. I think he's got a bad one now. They watched the little squirrel as he tapped the walnut shell with his knuckles. He cocked his head to one side, listening intently, then suddenly he threw the nut over his shoulder into a large hole in the floor. Hey, Mummy, shouted Veruca Salt suddenly, I've decided I want a squirrel. Get me one of those squirrels. Don't be silly, sweetheart, said Mrs. Salt. These all belong to Mr. Wonka. I don't care about that, shouted Veruca. I want one. All I've got at home is 2 dogs and 4 cats and 6 rabbits and 2 parakeets and 3 canaries and a green parrot and a turtle and a bowl of goldfish and a cage of white mice and a silly old hamster. I want a squirrel. All right, my pet, Mrs. Salt said soothingly. Mummy'll get you a squirrel just as soon as she possibly can. But I don't want any old squirrel. Veruca shouted. I want a trained squirrel. At this point, Mr. Salt, Veruca's father, stepped forward. Very well, Wonka, he said importantly, taking out a wallet full of money. How much do you want for one of these squirrels? Name your price. They're not for sale, Mr. Wonka answered. She can't have one. Who says I can't? Shouted Veruca. I'm going in to get myself one this very minute. Don't, said Mr. Wonka quickly, but he was too late. The girl had already thrown open the door and rushed in. The moment she entered the room, 100 squirrels stopped what they were doing and turned their heads and stared at her with small black eyes. Veruca Salt stopped also, and stared back at them. Then her look fell upon a pretty little squirrel sitting nearest to her at the end of the table. The squirrel was holding a walnut in its paws. All right, Veruca said, I'll have you. She reached out her hands to grab the squirrel, but as she did so, there was a sudden flash of movement in the room, like a flash of brown lightning, and every single squirrel around the table took a flying leap towards her and landed on her body. 25 of them caught hold of her right arm, and pinned it down. 25 more caught hold of her left arm, and pinned that down. 25 caught hold of her right leg and anchored it to the ground. 20-4 caught hold of her left leg. And the one remaining squirrel, obviously the leader of them all, climbed up onto her shoulder and started tapping the girl's head with its knuckles. Save her, screamed Mrs. Salt. Veruca! Come back! What are they doing to her? They're testing her to see if she's a bad nut, said Mr. Wonka. You watch. Veruca struggled furiously, but the squirrels held her tight and she couldn't move. The squirrel on her shoulder went tapping the side of her head with his knuckles. Then all at once, the squirrels pulled Veruca to the ground and started carrying her across the floor. "My goodness, she's a bad nut after all," said Mr. Wonka. "Her head must have sounded quite hollow." Veruca kicked and screamed, but it was no use. The tiny strong paws held her tightly and she couldn't escape. "Where are they taking her?" shrieked Mrs. Salt. "She's going where all the other bad nuts go," said Mr. Willy Wonka. "Down the rubbish chute." "By golly, she is going down the chute," said Mr. Salt, staring through the glass door at his daughter. "Then save her," cried Mrs. Salt. "Too late," said Mr. Wonka. "She's gone." And indeed she had. "But where?" shrieked Mrs. Salt. "What happens to the bad nuts? Where does the chute go to?" "That particular chute," Mr. Wonka told her, "runs directly into the great big main rubbish pipe which carries away all the rubbish from every part of the factory, all the floor sweepings and potato peelings and rotten cabbages and fish heads and stuff like that." "Who eats fish and cabbage and potatoes in this factory, I'd like to know?" said Mike TV. "I do, of course," answered Mr. Wonka. "You don't think I live on cacao beans, do you?" But, shrieked Mrs. Salt, "where does the great big pipe go to in the end?" "Why, to the furnace, of course," Mr. Wonka said calmly. Mrs. Salt opened her huge red mouth and started to scream. "Don't worry," said Mr. Wonka, "there's always a chance that they've decided not to light it today." "A chance," yelled Mrs. Salt. "My darling Veruca. She'll be fried like a sausage." "Quite right, my dear," said Mr. Salt. "Now see here, Wonka," he added, "I think you've gone just a shade too far this time. My daughter may be a bit of a frump, but that doesn't mean you can roast her to a crisp. I'll have you know I'm extremely cross about this, I really am." "Oh, don't be cross, my dear sir," said Mr. Wonka. "I expect she'll turn up again sooner or later. She may not even have gone down at all. She may be stuck in the chute just below the entrance hole, and if that's the case, all you'll have to do is go in and pull her up again." Hearing this, both Mr. and Mrs. Salt hurried into the nut room and ran over to the hole in the floor and peered in. "Veruca," shouted Mrs. Salt. "Are you down there?" There was no answer. Mrs. Salt bent further forward to get a closer look. She was now kneeling right on the edge of the hole with her head down and her enormous behind sticking up in the air like a giant mushroom. It was a dangerous position to be in. She needed only one tiny little push, and that is exactly what the squirrels gave her. And she fell into the hole head first, screeching like a parrot. "Good gracious me," said Mr. Salt, as he watched his fat wife go down the hole, "what a lot of rubbish there's going to be today." He saw her disappearing into the darkness. "What's it like down there, Angina?" he called out. He leaned further forward. The squirrels rushed up behind him. "Help!" he shouted. But he was already toppling forward, and down the chute he went, just as his wife had done before him and his daughter. "Oh, Dad!" cried Charlie, who was watching with the others through the door. "What on earth's going to happen to them now?" "I expect someone will catch them at the bottom of the chute," said Mr. Wonka. "But what about the great furnace?" asked Charlie. "They only light it every other day," said Mr. Wonka. "Perhaps this is one of the days when they let it go out. You never know, They might be lucky. SSSHH, said Grandpa Joe. Listen. Here comes another song. From far away down the corridor came the beating of drums. Then the singing began. Veruca Salt, sang the Oompa Loompas. Veruca Salt, the little brute, has just gone down the rubbish chute. And as we very rightly thought, that in a case like this we ought to see the thing completely through. We've polished of her parents, too. Chapter 25. The Great Glass Lift. I've never seen anything like it, cried Mr. Wonka. The children are disappearing like rabbits. But you mustn't worry about it. They'll all come out in the wash. Mr. Wonka looked at the little group that stood beside him in the corridor. There were only 2 children left now, Mike TV and Charlie Bucket. And there were 3 grown-ups, Mr. and Mrs. TV and Grandpa Joe. Shall we move on? Mr. Wonka asked. Oh, yes, cried Charlie and Grandpa Joe, both together. My feet are getting tired, said Mike TV. I want to watch television. If you're tired, then we'd better take the lift, said Mr. Wonka. It's over here. Come on. In we go. He skipped across the passage to a pair of double doors. The doors opened. The 2 children and the grown-ups went in. Now then, cried Mr. Wonka, which button shall we press first? Take your pick. Charlie Bucket stared around him in astonishment. This was the craziest lift he had ever seen. There were buttons everywhere. The walls, and even the ceiling, were covered all over with rows and rows and rows of small, black push buttons. And now Charlie noticed that every single button had a tiny printed label beside it telling you which room you would be taken to if you pressed it. This isn't just an ordinary up and down lift, announced Mr. Wonka proudly. This lift can go sideways and long ways and slantways and any other way you can think of. It can visit any single room in the whole factory, no matter where it is. You simply press the button, and zing. You're off. Fantastic, murmured Grandpa Joe. His eyes were shining with excitement as he stared at the rows of buttons. The whole lift is made of thick, clear glass, Mr. Wonka declared. Walls, doors, ceiling, floor, everything is made of glass so that you can see out. But there's nothing to see, said Mike TV. Choose a button, said Mr. Wonka. The 2 children may press 1 button each. So take your pick. Hurry up. In every room, something delicious and wonderful is being made. Quickly, Charlie started reading some of the labels alongside the buttons. The rock candy mine 10,000 feet deep, it said on one. Coconut ice skating rinks, it said on another. Then, strawberry juice water pistols. Invisible chocolate bars for eating in class. Sugar-coated pencils for sucking. Fizzy lemonade swimming pools. And many other labels. Come on, cried Mr. Wonka. We can't wait all day. Isn't there a television room in all this lot? Asked Mike TV. Certainly there's a television room, Mr. Wonka said. That button over there. He pointed with his finger. Everybody looked. Television chocolate, it said on the tiny label beside the button. Whoopee, shouted Mike TV. That's for me. And he pressed the button. Instantly, there was a tremendous whizzing noise. The doors shut and the lift leaped away as though it had been stung by a wasp. But it leapt sideways. And all the passengers, except Mr. Wonka, who was holding on to a strap from the ceiling, fell onto the floor. Get up, cried Mr. Wonka, roaring with laughter. But just as they were getting up to their feet, the lift changed direction and turned violently round a corner. And over they went once more. Help, shouted Mrs. TV. Take my hand, madam, said Mr. Wonka gallantly. There you are. Now grab this strap. Everybody grab a strap. The journey's not over yet. Old Grandpa Joe got up to his feet and caught hold of a strap. Little Charlie, who couldn't possibly reach as high as that, put his arms around Grandpa Joe's legs and hung on tight. The lift rushed on at the speed of a rocket. Now it was beginning to climb. It was shooting up and up and up on a steep slant course as if it were climbing a very steep hill. Then suddenly, as though it had come to the top of the hill and gone over a precipice, it dropped like a stone and Charlie felt his tummy coming right up into his throat, and Grandpa Joe shouted, Yippee! Here we go! And Mrs. TV cried out, the rope has broken. We're going to crash. And Mr. Wonka said, calm yourself, my dear lady, and patted her comfortingly on the arm. And then Grandpa Joe looked down at Charlie, who was clinging to his legs, and he said, Are you all right, Charlie? Charlie shouted, I love it. It's like being on a roller coaster. And now the lift began flattening out again, but it seemed to be going faster than ever, and Charlie could hear the scream of the wind outside as it went forward, and it twisted, and it turned, and it went up, and it went down, and... I'm going to be sick, yelled Mrs. TV, turning green in the face. Please don't be sick, said Mr. Wonka. Try and stop me, said Mrs. TV. Then you'd better take this, said Mr. Wonka, and he took his magnificent black top hat off his head, and held it out, upside down, in front of Mrs. TV's mouth. Make this awful thing stop, ordered Mr. TV. Can't do that, said Mr. Wonka. It won't stop till we get there. I only hope no one's using the other lift at this moment. What other lift? Screamed Mrs. TV. The one that goes the opposite way on the same track as this one, said Mr. Wonka. Holy mackerel, cried Mr. TV. You mean we might have a collision? I've always been lucky so far, said Mr. Wonka. Now I am going to be sick, yelled Mrs. TV. No, said Mr. Wonka. Not now. We're nearly there. Don't spoil my hat. The next moment, there was a screaming of brakes, and the lift began to slow down. Then it stopped. Some ride, said Mr. TV, wiping his great sweaty face with a handkerchief. Never again, said Mrs. TV. And then the doors of the lift opened and Mr. Wonka said, Just a minute now. Listen to me. I want everybody to be very careful in this room. There is dangerous stuff around in here and you must not tamper with it. Chapter 26. The Television Chocolate Room. The TV family, together with Charlie and Grandpa Joe, stepped out of the lift into a room so dazzlingly bright and dazzlingly white that they screwed up their eyes in pain and stopped walking. Mr. Wonka handed each of them a pair of dark glasses and said, Put these on quick. And don't take them off in here whatever you do. This light could blind you. As soon as Charlie had his dark glasses on, he was able to look around him in comfort. He saw a long narrow room. The room was painted white all over. Even the floor was white, and there wasn't a speck of dust anywhere. From the ceiling, huge lamps hung down and lit the room in a brilliant blue-white light. The room was completely bare except at the far ends. At one of these ends there was an enormous camera on wheels, and a whole army of Oompa Loompas was around it, oiling its joints and adjusting its knobs and polishing its great glass lens. The Oompa Loompas were all dressed in the most extraordinary way. They were wearing bright red space suits, complete with helmets and goggles. At least they looked like space suits, and they were working in complete silence. Watching them, Charlie experienced a queer sense of danger. There was something dangerous about this whole business, and the Oompa Loompas knew it. There was no chattering or singing among them here, and they moved about over the huge black camera slowly and carefully in their red space suits. At the other end of the room, about 50 paces away from the camera, a single Oompa Loompa, also wearing a space suit, was sitting at a black table gazing at the screen of a very large television set. "Here we go," cried Mr. Wonka, hopping up and down with excitement. "This is the testing room for my very latest and greatest invention, television chocolate." "But what?" "Television chocolate?" asked Mike TV. "Good heavens, child, stop interrupting me," said Mr. Wonka. "It works by television." "I don't like television myself. I suppose it's all right in small doses, but children never seem to be able to take it in small doses. They want to sit there all day long staring and staring at the screen." "That's me," said Mike TV. "Shut up," said Mr. TV. "Thank you," said Mr. Wonka. "I shall now tell you how this amazing television set of mine works. But first of all, do you know how ordinary television works? It is very simple. At one end, where the picture is being taken, you have a large camera and you start photographing something. The photographs are then split up into millions of tiny little pieces which are so small that you can't see them, and these little pieces are shot out into the sky by electricity. In the sky, they go whizzing around all over the place until suddenly they hit the antenna on the roof of somebody's house. They then go down the wire that leads right into the back of the television set, and in there they get jiggled and joggled around until at last every single one of those millions of tiny pieces is fitted back into its right place, just like a jigsaw puzzle, and finally, the photograph appears on the screen. "That isn't exactly how it works," Mike TV said. "I am a little deaf in my left ear," Mr. Wonka said. "You must forgive me if I don't hear everything you say." "I said, that isn't exactly how it works," shouted Mike TV. "You're a nice boy," Mr. Wonka said, "but you talk too much. Now then." The very first time I saw ordinary television working, I was struck by a tremendous idea. "Look here!" I shouted. "If these people can break up a photograph into millions of pieces and send the pieces whizzing through the air and then put them together again at the other end, why can't I do the same thing with a bar of chocolate? Why can't I send a real bar of chocolate whizzing through the air in tiny pieces and then put the pieces together at the other end, all ready to be eaten?" "Impossible," said Mike TV. "You think so?" cried Mr. Wonka. "Well, watch this. I shall now send a bar of my very best chocolate from one end of this room to the other by television. Get ready, there." Bring in the chocolate. Immediately, 6 Oompa Loompas marched forward carrying on their shoulders the most enormous bar of chocolate Charlie had ever seen. It was about the size of the mattress he slept on at home. It has to be big, Mr. Wonka explained, because whenever you send something by television, it always comes out much smaller than it was when it went in. Even with ordinary television, when you photograph a big man, he never comes out on your screen any taller than a pencil, does he? Here we go, then. Get ready. No, no. Stop. You there. Mike TV. Stand back. You're too close to the camera. There are dangerous rays coming out of that thing. They could break you up into a million tiny pieces in 1 second. That's why the Oompa Loompas are wearing spacesuits. The suits protect them. All right. That's better. Now, then. Switch on. One of the Oompa Loompas pulled down a large switch. The chocolate's gone, shouted Grandpa Joe, waving his arms. He was quite right. The whole enormous bar of chocolate had disappeared completely into thin air. It's on its way, cried Mr. Wonka. It is now rushing through the air above our heads in a million tiny pieces. Quick! Come over here. He dashed over to the other end of the room where the large television set was standing, and the others followed him. Watch the screen, he cried. Here it comes. Look. The screen lit up. Then suddenly, a small bar of chocolate appeared in the middle of the screen. Take it, shouted Mr. Wonka, growing more and more excited. How can you take it? Asked Mike TV, laughing. It's just a picture on a television screen. Charlie Bucket, cried Mr. Wonka. You take it. Reach out and grab it. Charlie put out his hand and touched the screen, and suddenly, miraculously, the bar of chocolate came away in his fingers. He was so surprised he nearly dropped it. Eat it, shouted Mr. Wonka. Go on and eat it. It'll be delicious. It's the same bar. It's got smaller on the journey, that's all. It's absolutely fantastic, gasped Grandpa Joe. It's a miracle. Just imagine, cried Mr. Wonka, when I start using this across the country, you'll be sitting at home watching television and suddenly a commercial will flash onto the screen and a voice will say eat Wonka's chocolates. They're the best in the world. If you don't believe us, try one for yourself now. And you simply reach out and take one. How about that, eh? Terrific, cried Grandpa Joe. It will change the world. Chapter 27. Mike TV is sent by television. Mike TV was even more excited than Grandpa Joe when he saw how a bar of chocolate was sent by television. But Mr. Wonka, he shouted, can you send other things through the air in the same way? Breakfast cereal, for instance? Oh, my sainted aunt, cried Mr. Wonka. Do you know what breakfast cereal is made of? It's made of all those little curly wooden shavings you find in pencil sharpeners. But could you send it by television if you wanted to, as you do chocolate? Asked Mike TV. Of course I could. And what about people? Asked Mike TV. Could you send a real live person from one place to another in the same way? A person? Cried Mr. Wonka. Are you crazy? But could it be done? Good heavens, child, I really don't know. I suppose it could, yes. I'm pretty sure it could, of course it could. I wouldn't like to risk it, though, it might have some very bad results. But Mike TV was already off and running. The moment he heard Mr. Wonka saying, "I'm pretty sure it could, of course it could," he turned away and started running as fast as he could towards the other end of the room where the great camera was standing. "Look at me," he shouted as he ran. "I'm going to be the first person in the world to be sent by television." "No, no, no," cried Mr. Wonka. "Mike," screamed Mrs. TV. "Stop! Come back! You'll be turned into a million tiny pieces." But there was no stopping Mike TV now. The crazy boy rushed on, and when he reached the enormous camera, he jumped straight for the switch, scattering Oompa Loompas right and left as he went. "See you later, alligator," he shouted, and he pulled down the switch. There was a blinding flash. Then there was silence. Then Mrs. TV ran forward, but she stopped dead in the middle of the room, and she stood there. She stood staring at the place where her son had been, and her great red mouth opened wide and she screamed, "He's gone! He's gone! Great heavens, he has gone!" shouted Mr. TV. Mr. Wonka hurried forward and placed a hand gently on Mrs. TV's shoulder. "We shall have to hope for the best," he said. "We must pray that your little boy will come out unharmed at the other end." "Mike," screamed Mrs. TV, clasping her head in her hands. "Where are you?" "I'll tell you where he is," said Mr. TV. "He's whizzing around above our heads in a million tiny pieces." "Don't talk about it," wailed Mrs. TV. "We must watch the television set," said Mr. Wonka. "He may come through any moment." Mr. and Mrs. TV and Grandpa Joe and little Charlie and Mr. Wonka all gathered round the television and stared tensely at the screen. The screen was quite blank. "He's taking a long time to come across," said Mr. TV, wiping his brow. Oh dear," said Mr. Wonka. "I do hope that no part of him gets left behind." "What on earth do you mean?" asked Mr. TV sharply. "I don't wish to alarm you," said Mr. Wonka, "but sometimes happens that only about half the little pieces find their way into the television set. It happened last week. I don't know why, but the result was that only half a bar of chocolate came through." Mrs. TV let out a scream of horror. "You mean only half of Mike is coming back to us?" she cried. "Let's hope it's the top half," said Mr. TV. "Watch the screen." "Something's happening," said Mr. Wonka. The screen had suddenly begun to flicker. Then some wavy lines appeared. Mr. Wonka adjusted one of the knobs and the wavy lines went away. And now, very slowly, the screen began to get brighter and brighter. "Here he comes," yelled Mr. Wonka. "Yes, that's him all right." "Is he all in one piece?" cried Mrs. TV. "I'm not sure," said Mr. Wonka. "It's too early to tell." Faintly at first, but becoming clearer and clearer every second, the picture of Mike TV appeared on the screen. He was standing up and waving at the audience and smiling from ear to ear. "But he's midget," shouted Mr. TV. "Mike," cried Mrs. TV, "are you all right? Are there any bits of you missing? Isn't he going to get any bigger?" shouted Mr. TV. "Talk to me, Mike," cried Mrs. TV. "Say something." Tell me you're all right. A tiny little voice, no louder than the squeaking of a mouse, came out of the television set. "Hi, Mum," it said. "Hi, Pop. Look at me. I'm the first person ever to be sent by television." "Grab him," ordered Mr. Wonka. "Quick!" Mrs. TV shot out a hand and picked the tiny figure of Mike TV out of the screen. "Hooray!" cried Mr. Wonka. "He's all in one piece. He's completely unharmed." "You call that unharmed?" snapped Mrs. TV, looking at the little speck of a boy who was now running across the palm of her hand, waving his pistols in the air. He was certainly not more than an inch tall. "He's shrunk," said Mr. TV. "Of course he's shrunk," said Mr. Wonka. "What did you expect?" "This is terrible," wailed Mrs. TV. "What are we going to do?" And Mr. TV said, "We can't send him back to school like this. He'll be squashed." "He won't be able to do anything," cried Mrs. TV. "Oh, yes I will," squeaked the tiny voice of Mike TV. "I'll still be able to watch television." "Never again," shouted Mr. TV. "I'm throwing the television set right out the window the moment we get home. I've had enough of television." When he heard this, Mike TV flew into a terrible tantrum. He started jumping up and down on the palm of his mother's hand, screaming and yelling and trying to bite her fingers. "I want to watch television," he squeaked. "I want to watch television. I want to watch television. Here." "Give him to me," said Mr. TV, and he took the tiny boy and shoved him into the breast pocket of his jacket and stuffed a handkerchief on top. Squeals and yells came from inside the pocket, and the pocket shook as the furious little prisoner fought to get out. "Oh, Mr. Wonka," wailed Mrs. TV, "how can we make him grow?" "Well," said Mr. Wonka, stroking his beard and gazing thoughtfully at the ceiling, "I must say that's a bit tricky. But small boys are extremely springy and elastic. They stretch like mad. So what we'll do, we'll put him in a special machine I have for testing the stretchiness of chewing gum. Maybe that will bring him back to what he was." "Oh, thank you," said Mrs. TV. "Don't mention it, dear lady." "How far do you think he'll stretch?" asked Mr. TV. "Maybe miles," said Mr. Wonka. "Who knows? But he's going to be awfully thin. Everything gets thinner when you stretch it." "You mean like chewing gum?" asked Mr. TV. "Exactly." "How thin will he be?" asked Mrs. TV anxiously. "I haven't the foggiest idea," said Mr. Wonka. "And it doesn't really matter, anyway, because we'll soon fatten him up again. All we'll have to do is give him a triple dose of my wonderful supervitamin chocolate." Supervitamin chocolate contains huge amounts of different vitamins. "And what will that do to him?" asked Mr. TV anxiously. "It'll make his toes grow out until they're as long as his fingers." "Oh, no," cried Mrs. TV. "Don't be silly," said Mr. Wonka. "It's most useful. He'll be able to play the piano with his feet." "But Mr. Wonka—" "No arguments, please." At the end of the room, the Oompa Loompas around the giant camera were already beating their tiny drums and beginning to jog up and down to the rhythm. "There they go again," said Mr. Wonka. "I'm afraid you can't stop them singing." Little Charlie caught Grandpa Joe's hand, and the two of them stood beside Mr. Wonka in the middle of the long bright room, listening to the Oompa Loompas. And this is what they sang. The most important thing we've learned, so far as children are concerned, is never, never let them near your television set. Or better still, just don't install the idiotic thing at all. Regarding Mike TV, we very much regret that we shall simply have to wait and see if we can get him back his height. But if we cannot, it serves him right. Chapter 28. Only Charlie left. Which room shall it be next? Said Mr. Wonka as he turned away and rushed into the lift. Come on. Hurry up. We must get going. And how many children are there left now? Little Charlie looked at Grandpa Joe, and Grandpa Joe looked back at little Charlie. But Mr. Wonka, Grandpa Joe called after him, there's only Charlie left now. Mr. Wonka turned round and stared at Charlie. There was a silence. Charlie stood there holding tightly on to Grandpa Joe's hand. You mean you're the only one left? Mr. Wonka said, pretending to be surprised. Why, yes, whispered Charlie. Yes. Mr. Wonka suddenly exploded with excitement. But my dear boy, he cried out, that means you won. He rushed out of the lift and started shaking Charlie's hand so furiously it nearly came off. Oh, I do congratulate you, he cried. I really do. I'm absolutely delighted. It couldn't be better. How wonderful this is. I had a hunch you knew, right from the beginning, that it was going to be you. Well done, Charlie, well done. This is terrific. Now the fun is really going to start. But we mustn't dilly. We mustn't dally. There's even less time to lose now than there was before. We have an enormous number of things to do before the day is out. Just think of the arrangements that have to be made. And the people we have to fetch. But luckily for us, we have the great glass lift to speed things up. Jump in, my dear Charlie, jump in. You too, Grandpa Joe, sir. No, after you. That's the way. Now then. This time I shall choose the button we are going to press. Mr. Wonka's bright blue eyes rested for a moment on Charlie's face. Something crazy is going to happen now, Charlie thought. But he wasn't frightened. He wasn't even nervous. He was just terrifically excited. And so was Grandpa Joe. The old man's face was shining with excitement as he watched every move that Mr. Wonka made. Mr. Wonka was reaching for a button high up on the glass ceiling of the lift. Charlie and Grandpa Joe both craned their necks to read what it said on the little label beside the button. It said, "Up and out." Up and out, thought Charlie. What sort of a room is that? Mr. Wonka pressed the button. The glass doors closed. Hold on, cried Mr. Wonka. Then wham! The lift shot straight up like a rocket. Yippee! Shouted Grandpa Joe. Charlie was clinging to Grandpa Joe's legs and Mr. Wonka was holding on to a strap from the ceiling, and up they went, up, straight up this time, with no twisting or turnings, and Charlie could hear the whistling of the air outside as the lift went faster and faster. Yippee! Shouted Grandpa Joe again. Yippee! Here we go. Faster, cried Mr. Wonka, banging the wall of the lift with his hand. Faster. Faster. If we don't go any faster than this, we shall never get through. Through what? Shouted Grandpa Joe. What have we got to get through? Aha, cried Mr. Wonka, you wait and see. I've been longing to press this button for years. But I've never done it until now. I was tempted many times. Oh, yes, I was tempted. But I couldn't bear the thought of making a great big hole in the roof of the factory. Here we go, boys. Up and out. But you don't mean, shouted Grandpa Joe, you don't really mean that this lift? Oh yes, I do, answered Mr. Wonka. You wait and see. Up and out. But, it's made of glass, shouted Grandpa Joe. It'll break into a million pieces. I suppose it might, said Mr. Wonka, cheerful as ever, but it's pretty thick glass, all the same. The lift rushed on, going up and up and up, faster and faster and faster. Then suddenly, crash, and the most tremendous noise of splintering wood and broken tiles came from directly above their heads, and Grandpa Joe shouted, "Help! It's the end! We're done for," and Mr. Wonka said, "No, we're not. We're through. We're out." Sure enough, the lift had shot right up through the roof of the factory and was now rising into the sky like a rocket, and the sunshine was pouring in through the glass roof. In 5 seconds they were 1,000 feet up in the sky. "The lift's gone mad," shouted Grandpa Joe. "Have no fear, my dear sir," said Mr. Wonka calmly, and he pressed another button. The lift stopped. It stopped and hung in midair, hovering like a helicopter, hovering over the factory and over the very town itself, which lay spread out below them like a picture postcard. Looking down through the glass floor on which he was standing, Charlie could see the small faraway houses and the streets and the snow that lay thickly over everything. It was an eerie feeling to be standing on clear glass high up in the sky. It made you feel that you weren't standing on anything at all. "Are we all right?" cried Grandpa Joe. "How does this thing stay up?" "Sugar power," said Mr. Wonka. 1,000,000 sugar power. "Oh, look," he cried, pointing down, "there go the other children. They're returning home." Chapter 29. The other children go home. "We must go down and take a look at our little friends before we do anything else," said Mr. Wonka. He pressed a different button, and the lift dropped lower, and soon it was hovering just above the entrance gates to the factory. Looking down now, Charlie could see the children and their parents standing in a little group just inside the gates. "I can only see 3, he said. "Who's missing?" "I expect it's Mike TV," Mr. Wonka said. "But he'll be coming along soon. Do you see the trucks?" Mr. Wonka pointed to a line of gigantic covered vans parked in a line nearby. "Yes," Charlie said. "What are they for?" "Don't you remember what it said on the golden tickets? Every child goes home with a lifetime supply of sweets. There's 1 truckload for each of them, loaded to the brim." "Aha," Mr. Wonka went on, "there goes our friend Augustus Gloop. Do you see him? He's getting into the first truck with his mother and father." "You mean he's really all right?" asked Charlie, astonished. "Even after going up that awful pipe?" "He's very much all right," said Mr. Wonka. "He's changed," said Grandpa Joe, looking down through the glass wall of the elevator. "He used to be fat. Now he's thin as a straw." "Of course he's changed," said Mr. Wonka, laughing. "He got squeezed in the pipe. Don't you remember? And look! There goes Miss Violet Beauregard, the great gum chewer. It seems as though they managed to de-juice her after all. I'm so glad. And how healthy she looks! Much better than before." "But she's purple in the face," cried Grandpa Joe. "So she is," said Mr. Wonka. "Ah, well, there's nothing we can do about that." "Good gracious," cried Charlie. "Look at poor Veruca Salt and Mr. Salt and Mrs. Salt. They're simply covered with rubbish." "And here comes Mike TV," said Grandpa Joe. "Good heavens! What have they done to him? He's about 10 feet tall and thin as a wire." "They've overstretched him on the gum-stretching machine," said Mr. Wonka. "But how dreadful for him," cried Charlie. "Nonsense," said Mr. Wonka. "He's very lucky. Every basketball team in the country will be trying to get him. But now," he added, "it is time we left these 4 silly children. I have something very important to talk to you about, my dear Charlie." Mr. Wonka pressed another button, and the lift went upwards into the sky. Chapter 30. Charlie's Chocolate Factory. The great glass lift was now hovering high over the town. Inside the lift stood Mr. Wonka, Grandpa Joe, and little Charlie. "How I love my chocolate factory," said Mr. Wonka, looking down. Then he paused, and he turned around and looked at Charlie with a most serious expression on his face. "Do you love it too, Charlie?" he asked. "Oh, yes," cried Charlie. "I think it's the most wonderful place in the whole world." "I am very pleased to hear you say that," said Mr. Wonka, looking more serious than ever. He went on staring at Charlie. "Yes," he said, "I am very pleased indeed to hear you say that. And now I shall tell you why." Mr. Wonka cocked his head to one side, and all at once the tiny wrinkles of a smile appeared around the corners of his eyes, and he said, "You see, my dear boy, I have decided to make you a present of the whole place. As soon as you are old enough to run it, the entire factory will become yours." Charlie stared at Mr. Wonka. Grandpa Joe opened his mouth to speak, but no words came out. "It's quite true," Mr. Wonka said, smiling broadly now. "I really am giving it to you." "That's all right, isn't it?" "Giving it to him?" gasped Grandpa Joe. "You must be joking." "I'm not joking, sir. I'm deadly serious." But, why should you want to give your factory to little Charlie?" "Listen," Mr. Wonka said, "I'm an old man. I'm much older than you think. I've got no children of my own, no family at all. So who is going to run the factory when I get too old to do it myself? Someone's got to keep it going, if only for the sake of the Oompa Loompas. Mind you, there are thousands of clever men who would give anything for the chance to come in and take over for me, but I don't want that sort of person. I don't want a grown-up person at all. A grown-up won't listen to me, he won't learn. He will try to do things his own way and not mine. So I have to have a child. I want a good, sensible, loving child, one to whom I can tell all my most precious sweet-making secrets while I am still alive. So that is why you sent out the golden tickets, cried Charlie. Exactly, said Mr. Wonka. I decided to invite 5 children to the factory, and the one I liked best at the end of the day would be the winner. But Mr. Wonka, stammered Grandpa Joe, do you really and truly mean that you are giving the whole of this enormous factory to little Charlie? After all, there's no time for arguments, cried Mr. Wonka. We must go at once and fetch the rest of the family, Charlie's father and his mother and anyone else that's around. They can all live in the factory from now on. They can all help to run it until Charlie is old enough to do it by himself. Where do you live, Charlie? Charlie looked down through the glass floor at the snow-covered houses that lay below. It's over there, he said, pointing. It's that little cottage right on the edge of the town, the tiny little one. I see it, cried Mr. Wonka, and he pressed some more buttons and the lift shot down towards Charlie's house. I'm afraid my mother won't come with us, Charlie said sadly. Why ever not? Because she won't leave Grandma Josephine and Grandma Georgina and Grandpa George. But they must come too. They can't, Charlie said. They're very old and they haven't been out of bed for 20 years. Then we'll take the bed along as well, with them in it, said Mr. Wonka. There's plenty of room in this lift for a bed. You couldn't get the bed out of the house, said Grandpa Joe. It won't go through the door. You mustn't despair, cried Mr. Wonka. Nothing is impossible. You watch. The lift was now hovering over the roof of the Bucket's little house. What are you going to do? Cried Charlie. I'm going right on in to fetch them, said Mr. Wonka. How? Asked Grandpa Joe. Through the roof, said Mr. Wonka, pressing another button. No, shouted Charlie. Stop, shouted Grandpa Joe. Crash went the lift, right down through the roof of the house into the old people's bedroom. Showers of dust and broken tiles and bits of wood and cockroaches and spiders and bricks and cement went raining down on the 3 old ones who were lying in bed, and each of them thought that the end of the world was come. Grandma Georgina fainted, Grandma Josephine dropped her false teeth, Grandpa George put his head under the blanket, and Mr. and Mrs. Bucket came rushing in from the next room. Save us, cried Grandma Josephine. Calm yourself, my darling wife, said Grandpa Joe, stepping out of the lift. It's only us. Mother, cried Charlie, rushing into Mrs. Bucket's arms. Mother. Mother. Listen to what's happened. We're all going back to live in Mr. Wonka's factory and we're going to help him to run it and he's given it all to me and. What are you talking about? Said Mrs. Bucket. Just look at our house, cried poor Mr. Bucket. It's in ruins. My dear sir, said Mr. Wonka, jumping forward and shaking Mr. Bucket warmly by the hand, I'm so very glad to meet you. You mustn't worry about your house. From now on, you're never going to need it again, anyway. Who is this crazy man? Screamed Grandma Josephine. He could have killed us all. This, said Grandpa Joe, is Mr. Willy Wonka himself. It took quite a time for Grandpa Joe and Charlie to explain to everyone exactly what had been happening to them all day. And even then they all refused to ride back to the factory in the lift. I'd rather die in my bed, shouted Grandma Josephine. So would I, cried Grandma Georgina. I refuse to go, announced Grandpa George. So Mr. Wonka and Grandpa Joe and Charlie, taking no notice of their screams, simply pushed the bed into the lift. They pushed Mr. and Mrs. Bucket in after it. Then they got in themselves. Mr. Wonka pressed a button. The doors closed. Grandma Georgina screamed. And the lift rose up off the floor and shot through the hole in the roof, out into the open sky. Charlie climbed onto the bed and tried to calm the three old people who were still petrified with fear. "Please don't be frightened," he said. "It's quite safe. And we're going to the most wonderful place in the world." "Charlie's right," said Grandpa Joe. "Will there be anything to eat when we get there?" asked Grandma Josephine. "I'm starving. The whole family is starving." "Anything to eat," cried Charlie, laughing. "Oh, you just wait and see,"